They beat against the houses, swarm in the windows, cover the passing trains. They work as if sent to destroy. One spring day in Kansas in 1875, the sky abruptly turned dark and stayed dark for 5 days straight. A living nightmare had descended and blocked out the sun. The darkness was combined with an oppressive noise, a rasping, grating roar that grew louder and louder until it was all anyone could hear. What was passing overhead was a monstrous swarm of insects, the Rocky Mountain locust, Melanoplus spretus, and there was an estimated 12.5 trillion of them. Together, they formed a cloud 1,800 miles long and 110 miles wide, larger than the state of California, and their combined weight was over 27.5 million tons. It remained, to this day, the single greatest concentration of animals ever recorded in all of human history. And you have probably never heard of it, because less than 30 years later, the species disappeared. The story of Melanoplus spretus is one of the most unsettling in the history of entomology. It is a story about a creature so numerous and destructive, it defies comprehension, and about how a civilization's relentless push westward quietly erased one of the most dominant creatures North America had ever seen. To understand how that happened, you first have to understand what this insect was. The Rocky Mountain locust resembles an ordinary grasshopper, brownish yellow with black markings. Its hind tibia sometimes has a distinctive blue or dark red marking. Its wings, when spread, extended noticeably beyond the tip of the abdomen, which is a distinguishing feature from many of its relatives. In its solitary form, living quietly in the mountain foothills, it wouldn't attract any attention. The locust was formally identified in 1866 when it was given the specific epithet spretus, meaning despised. The genus name Melanoplus is derived from Greek meaning black sail, a reference to its dark markings which are common across the genus. What separates a locust from a grasshopper is not species, but a social behavior. Locusts experience an extreme physical and behavioral transformation triggered by crowding. When the Rocky Mountain locust lived at low population densities, it was a solitary creature, never swarming. But when a drought followed by rain caused its numbers to swell and individuals began pressing against each other, the insect changed. They grew longer wings, got darker, and became more aggressive and mobile. The crowded locusts began to move together, first in small groups and then in huge swarms. The locust's permanent home was the river valleys and floodplains throughout the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, in what is now Montana, Wyoming, and western Canada. Here, the insects lived a quiet, solitary life between swarms. Eggs were laid just below the surface of the soil. The eggs overwintered and hatched in the late spring. By July, they were adults. The Rocky Mountain locust swarms followed a cycle, with major outbreaks recurring every 5 to 8 years. In their migratory phase, the swarms descended from the Rocky Mountain foothills and spread out across the Great Plains, riding western winds east and south, consuming every plant in their path. They were indiscriminate feeders, even eating tree bark and wooden fences. When food ran short, they ate leather, paper, fabric, and the wool directly off the backs of living sheep, dead animals, and eventually each other. Accounts describe rivers blocked with the bodies of locusts, railroad tracks so clogged and slick that the trains couldn't move, and creeks so polluted that livestock refused to drink. The locusts thrived in drought conditions. Warm, dry weather kept away their diseases and sped the insects' growth. A season of hot, dry weather, followed by a wet spring, was what farmers on the Great Plains came to call grasshopper weather. The terrible outbreaks of the 1870s came on exactly such a schedule. A severe drought in 1873, followed by a wet and favorable spring, and then the arrival of swarms so immense they sound fake. The outbreaks that ran from 1874 to 1877 were a generational catastrophe. Swarms swept across an area of more than 5 million square kilometers, destroying all the crops across North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. In some regions, the sky darkened for hours as locusts passed overhead. The voracity of these insects can hardly be imagined by those who have not witnessed them. In phalanx falling upon a cornfield and converting, in a few hours, the green and promising acres into a desolate stretch of bare, spindling stalks and stubs. Covering each hill by hundreds, scrambling from row to row like a lot of young, famished pigs led out to their trough. Insignificant individually, but mighty collectively, they sweep clean a field quicker than would a whole herd of hungry steers. Imagine hundreds of square miles covered with such a ravenous horde, and one can get some realization of the picture presented in many parts of the country west of the Mississippi during years of locust invasion. Farmers who ran outside to defend their fields found themselves wading through a foot or more of insects. Fire failed to stop them, because the locusts were so numerous they smothered the flames. Bounties were offered. In Missouri, up to $1 per bushel of dead locusts, and settlers resorted to dynamiting breeding grounds. 750,000 people were impacted, and more than 150,000 people were pushed into starvation. The United States government launched its most massive relief effort up to that point in the nation's history. The human suffering was extreme. The loss of a single crop could mean the loss of a year's food supply and income for families who had staked everything on farming Western land. Farms and ranches were completely destroyed. Food prices skyrocketed. Families who had walked hundreds of miles west to start new lives were forced to walk back to the eastern US to find work. Parts of Western Canada were maybe even worse off. Large chunks of Saskatchewan and Manitoba were left functionally uninhabitable. In 1877, the U.S. Entomological Commission, led by the entomologist Charles Valentine Riley, published a comprehensive report titled The Locust Plague in the United States. C.V. Riley is widely considered to be the father of modern American entomology, and this crisis was a defining moment for his career. His book is free and widely available online and is still considered essential reading for anyone interested in this topic. C.V. Riley's commission gathered witness testimony from across the affected states, mapped the locusts' probable breeding grounds in the Rockies, and proposed a range of control strategies, including eating the locusts directly. C.V. Riley even suggested that the locust problem might eventually resolve itself as settlement continued and the insects' breeding grounds were disrupted. The swarms of the 1870s gradually subsided. By the 1880s, farmers were recovering. They adapted by shifting to crops like winter wheat that matured before the worst locusts began to fly. The outbreaks diminished in scale through the 1880s and into the 1890s. No one rang any alarm bells about this declining of the locusts. No one mourned them. Occasionally, small numbers were reported, a sighting here or there, but nothing on the scale of the plagues. By the turn of the 20th century, the Rocky Mountain locust had become something of a historical memory. The last reliably confirmed living specimens were collected in July 1902 in Manitoba, Canada. 3 final specimens were gathered in Colorado in August of 1904 by an entomologist named Morgan Hebard, who noted with some curiosity the difficulty of finding any locusts at all in the Rocky Mountain region. And then, nothing. The species that had once counted its numbers in the trillions had vanished. The question of how this happened has not been fully solved. The most widely accepted explanation was developed by the entomologist Geoffrey Lockwood. In a landmark 1990 paper published in Environmental Entomology, Lockwood proposed what has become known as the permanent zone hypothesis. During their massive outbreaks, the insects laid eggs across the prairie, but those prairie eggs didn't thrive. The species' breeding population depended on the sandy, warm river valleys of the northern Rockies, where generation after generation had successfully reproduced. Those same river valleys were the most fertile and well watered lands in the entire region. In a process that unfolded with remarkable speed during the 1880s and 1890s, pioneers converted the Rocky Mountain river valleys into farms and ranches. They plowed the sandy soil where the locust eggs were buried. They diverted streams for irrigation. They allowed cattle and sheep to compact the earth beneath them. They eliminated the beaver populations, whose dams had maintained wet meadows. In doing all of this, they inadvertently destroyed the insect's breeding grounds. Because the Rocky Mountain locust was considered purely a pest, almost no scientific effort was ever devoted to understanding its biology. Specimens were rarely collected systematically. Its biology, beyond what could be immediately applied to controlling it, was simply ignored. The species had a trillion-strong population, yet yields almost no reliable scientific data, because everyone who encountered it only wanted to kill it. And when the locust disappeared, scientists suddenly realized that they had almost no idea how it worked, and that without that knowledge, no one understood why it was gone. Despite the official declaration of locust extinction in 2014, a small number of researchers have periodically raised the possibility that the Rocky Mountain locust might persist somewhere in its undetectable solitary phase, living quietly in remote valleys too inaccessible for systematic researching, particularly in the mountain valleys of northern Canada and Alaska. Lockwood himself conducted several expeditions into remote river valleys near Yellowstone in the 1990s and the early 2000s, searching for any trace of the locust in its solitary form. He found nothing. Today, the Rocky Mountain locust exists only in museum collections.